I have drawn maps of places no living thing has seen and lived to describe. That is not a boast. It is the plainest summary of what a senior cartographer of the Velhari Mapping Conclave does and has done for 41 years. We send probes. The probes return. We render what they carried into lines and gradients and the cold notation of boundary sectors. We name the unnamed. We file the unfileable. We make the dark legible. I am telling you this so you understand that I am not a being who frightens easily, and I am not a being who leaves things unlooked at. I have spent my career looking at things. It is the whole of the work. I left the 7th drift file sealed. I want to be precise about what the 7th drift is because the name gets used loosely now, and looseness is a kind of forgetting, and forgetting in cartography costs fleets. The 7th drift is the designation we assigned internally to a subsector running along the trailing edge of what the old guild charts marked only as the human boundary margin. Not inside the margin. Not inside the forbidden zone that every species with more than a century of spaceflight has learned, without being told explicitly, to treat as an absolute edge. The 7th drift is the approach, the anteroom, the last surveyed space before the atlas simply ends and the notation reads, in the oldest surviving chart language I know. Here the record does not continue. We were not crossing the line. I want to be clear on that as well. The probe's trajectory was designed by 4 of the most careful navigational minds in the conclave, and all 4 reviewed the flight envelope twice, and the outermost arc of the probe survey path was calibrated to come within 40 light minutes of the margin and no closer. We were mapping the drift itself, the gradients, the spatial density variations, the residual energy signatures that older surveys had flagged as anomalous but never resolved. Legitimate work. Documented work. Work I supervised personally. The probe departed. It ran its arc. It returned on schedule to the 2nd, which was itself unusual. Probes running the drift margin tended to arrive with small clock drift that we attributed to local metric distortions and never investigated closely enough. This one was perfectly punctual. I noted it. I filed it as a positive sign and began the data extraction. The imagery packages came in first, as they always do. I assigned a review to my 3 senior surveyors, Peleth of the Northern Mapping Desk, Osavar, who had run drift surveys longer than anyone else in the conclave, and a junior analyst named Thravain, who had been with us 8 months and whom I considered unusually talented. Standard review protocol. They sit with the imagery in the Lightroom, log their observations, and pass the flagged anomalies to me. Peleth came out of the Lightroom after 11 minutes. He did not speak. He went directly to his desk, sat down, and stared at the wall across from him. I asked him what the imagery showed. He said, very quietly, that he needed a moment. Osavar did not come out. I went in after 40 minutes when she had not emerged and had not responded to the intercom. She was seated at the review console, the imagery paused on a single frame. She was not looking at it. She was looking at her hands. I asked her what the imagery contained. She said, something I have not thought about in 30 years. I asked her what that meant. She closed the imagery file, stood up, and told me she was placing herself on medical leave effective immediately. She left the conclave that afternoon. I have not spoken with her since, though I understand she transferred to a ground station on a non-surveying posting and has remained there. Thravain, the junior analyst, 8 months in, talented. I found the imagery file still running when I entered the Lightroom the 2nd time. He was gone, not from the conclave, from a Lightroom. The imagery was running to an empty chair. I stopped it before I looked at the screen. I want to be precise about that. I stopped the playback before I allowed myself to look at what was on the screen. It is possible that I understood already from some part of my professional experience that processes things faster than my conscious attention does, that I should not look at it running. I stopped it. I looked at the frozen frame. What I saw was the interior of a room I had not been inside since I was young. A room in the dwelling where I grew up, on a world I have not returned to in 30 years. The curtains my parent used to hang in the long light season. A specific chair. The angle of an afternoon that does not exist at the latitude of any place I have worked since. The probe had not been to my homeworld. The probe had not been anywhere near my homeworld. The probe had run a survey arc in the 7th drift, 40 light minutes from a human boundary margin, and come back with imagery that contained a room I have never described to anyone at this conclave. A room I had not thought about consciously in perhaps a decade. I closed the file. I did not view any further imagery packages. I pulled the entire probe data return into a sealed archive container, applied the highest restriction classification the conclave system allows, and submitted a reclassification request to the senior archival board that same evening. The request was approved within 6 hours, which told me the archival board senior members did not need an explanation. They had seen something like this before, or they had been waiting for something like it. The 7th drift notation on our working charts was revised within the week. The subsector is now rendered as an extension of the human boundary margin itself. The line was moved outward. The 40 light minute buffer the probe had maintained no longer exists on paper, because on paper the sector the probe flew through is now part of the forbidden designation. A cartographer redrew the margin. No one issued a formal order that I have been able to find. Someone simply moved the line, and no one objected, and the old charts were archived. Vervain came back to work the following morning. He did not mention the Lightroom. When I asked him carefully what he had seen, he told me he did not remember sitting down at the console. He remembered beginning the review, and then he remembered standing in the corridor outside the Lightroom with no interval he could account for. He requested a transfer to the non-spatial data division 3 weeks later. I approved it without discussion. Peleth remained on the mapping desk. He is still here. We have not spoken about the probe imagery in the 4 years since. There is an understanding between us that is communicated entirely through the things we do not say, and I believe he finds it as adequate as I do. Here is what I have understood in those 4 years, working through the implications the way a cartographer works through an anomalous gradient, methodically, without rushing to a notation I cannot support with data. The probe was running along the margin of the human zone. It returned with imagery that reached into the memory of every being who reviewed it and showed them something private and specific and unchosen. Not a random comfort, not a generic warmth. Something pulled from somewhere the probe had no mechanism to access and no reason to know. The probe did not cross the line. The probe ran its arc at 40 light minutes from a margin and returned on a precise schedule. Whatever produced those images, whatever reached across 40 light minutes of surveyed space and read 3 separate beings and furnished each of them with something unrepeatable and specific, did not need us to cross over. It was already paying attention. It noticed the probe. It noticed the beings who would review the probe. It had time, in the 11 minutes between the probe's return and Peleth's exit from the Lightroom, to produce imagery so specific to each reviewer that one of them has not returned to survey work, one of them has not accounted for an interval of unknown duration, and one of them, who has 41 years of professional exposure to the unnerving, sat in a frozen Lightroom looking at curtains from a world he has not visited in 3 decades. I do not know what lives in the human zone. I have never known. No species that survives long enough to build a mapping conclave knows, because the ones who want to find out did not come back with findings anyone could read. What I know now, what I have added, quietly, to the margin notation in my personal working copy of the Drift Survey, is one line. It does not wait to be approached. I have not looked at the sealed file again. I have noticed twice in the last 18 months, a small mark on my work surface that I did not make, a faint indentation in the material, regular and deliberate, like a notation made by something with a precise instrument. I have not measured it. I have not recorded it. I have covered it with a reference chart, and I have not moved the chart. I do not intend to move the chart. The 7th drift file will remain sealed. My recommendation to the conclave, filed in writing and countersigned by the archival board, is that no further survey work be conducted in any subsector running within 100 light minutes of the human boundary margin, measured from the current revised line. 100 light minutes, not 40. We moved the number because the data suggested we had already been too close. I am a cartographer. I make the dark legible. There is one sector I have agreed, with full professional conviction, to leave dark. That is where the record ends.